Hello, everybody. Welcome to SBI's Reimagining Main Street podcast. I'm Patrick Lee, the CEO of SBI, the Spark Business Institute.
And I'm Laura Richards. And in today's podcast, reflections on Heineken's 2017 Open Your World ad campaign, we're going to talk about how to talk across divides and why it's important to do so.
This is something that has come up because in a bunch of our recent podcasts, we've been talking about how it's very frustrating to watch how folks can't seem to have the type of conversations necessary in our current crises to make good decisions. Everything's politicized. There's a whole bunch of conspiracy stuff out there. Well, I'm not going to listen to you. If you believe that, then you have nothing of value to say. And I think that's entirely the wrong way to approach any crisis.
Right. So, Patrick, about 5 minutes before this broadcast started, I revisited the video and rewatched it. And for those of you who have the opportunity, the link is at the start of our podcast. I highly encourage you to link to the YouTube and watch that 2017 Heineken ad, because what it demonstrates so well is that all of us as human beings have more connections, more ways we are alike and able to talk about different aspects of our lives than we do differences. Yet sometimes it's the differences that define us. And I think in moments like right now, where we find ourselves polarized politically, and then also on different sides of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's being handled, more than ever, we need to seek out those commonalities and embrace the opportunity to talk to each other. And this includes obviously in business.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has become apparent in our highly polarized climate, social climate at this point, is that I remember growing up and we had to learn how to debate. And that was like a big part of our communication learning was, what is a debate and how do you do it? And the format that we were taught was very simple. Okay, here's your topic. You take the pro side, you take the con side, go research it. And no matter what you believe, you need to be able to come in here and convince us of whichever side you were given, regardless of your belief system, because this is about how you debate using facts and presenting rhetoric, right? This is how rhetoric works. And what we watch now is there's no value to debate. What there is I believe this, I think this. As soon as you start to say something I don't think, I look at you a little funny, and then pretty soon I'm ignoring you or I'm shouting you down. That creation is relatively new. I mean, there's always been the fringe of that, but that sort of normalizing of that there is no such thing as a debate. It seems new to me, and maybe I'm just an old guy who's like back in the good old days, right? But the Heineken ad to me showed me something that I learned while I was ahead of Leadership Anne Arundel, where we taught community leadership. And that is that if you get to know somebody before you know their identifiers, before you know their political party, before you know their religion, before you know their sexual orientation, before you know almost anything, you will bond with them. And then you will forgive any differences, as you saw in the Heineken ad, because this person's a good person. I met them. But if you know all those identifiers before you get a chance to meet them, you'll never meet them. And that says a ton.
Right. Do you want to tell the people listening and watching what the premise of the Heineken ad is? Because we keep alluding to it, and maybe it's not as clear for them as we think it might be.
So the Heineken ad is kind of a neat advertising campaign. Basically, Heineken said, okay, we're going to bring people of very different stripes in. We're going to sit them down and we're going to interview them, and we're going to record the interview, and we're going to talk politics. We're going to talk certain issues with them. We're going to find out some deep-seated, both what they stand for and some biases that they have. Then we are going to pair them up with other folks, and they've never met. We're not going to tell them about each other, but we're going to give them a project. And they don't know what this is about. They're volunteering for it. They know it's being filmed. They're going about this, but they're not sure what the outcome is. They just know that this is an opportunity. They're going to be on television. You know, it's going to be kind of cool. Let's check it out. So they end up pairing up and they have a project. And that project is, it turns out, building a bar, like a bar that you would have in your basement, right? And so they're building and they're doing their stuff. And in that, they're bonding. They have to figure out, they don't know what this is. Let's figure it out. How does this work? And they're working together. At the end, they're sitting at the bar with, of course, a Heineken, right? And as they're sitting at that bar, they get shown who they each are. And of course, they're polar. They are polar, diametrically opposite folks. And then they say, well, what do you think? And invariably, the answer is, of course, well, if I was in a bar, I'd have a drink with that person, right? Like, they bonded now, so no, they're okay. That I don't agree with that, but I like them. It's a great ad. And I thought it was a great premise. The Heineken even coming up with that, I give them so many kudos for that.
Yeah. At the end, they give the candidates an opportunity to leave after it's revealed who the other one is, and or to sit down at the bar they've just built and drink a beer together. And in every case, obviously, they made the commercial anyway. They sat down and had a beer together, and it was amazing. I mean, some of the ideologies behind these folks and how strongly one could have felt about the other, and the fact that idea of bonding was stronger than the ideology was pretty emotional. I teared up a little bit. So
oh no, it's emotional. It's absolutely emotional. And so one of the community leadership things that would happen is that, you know, we're recruiting people from all over the county. And there's generally somewhere between 35 and 45 folks in what's called a class. And that class meets over a term of a year. Okay. And they have a bunch of retreats, and then they have specific days, like they have an education day, a government day, economic day. And that day, the whole group comes together and they learn about the county and they learn about that issue, and then they interact. The opening retreat is where that class gets bonded. And it's incredibly important because you could put a bunch of people on a bus and drive them around and show them stuff, but it's how the class becomes bonded that makes these things really engaging and a learning experience for everybody in it. And it's intentional, right? There's people from every possible walk of life and different industries, different ways of looking at things, different socioeconomic places, different political thoughts, everything. And we need to bond them. So one of the nifty things that we would do is that we would put them into groups of about 6. And that was their core team. And the very first exercise, not the very first, but very early on, there was an exercise where they all sat around and they got to introduce themselves, but there were rules. And the rule was that the person had to speak for 10 minutes about themselves. The rest of the people in the group couldn't comment. They were not to make any facial expressions. They were just to sit there and listen. And there was a timekeeper. And that timekeeper would say, start. You have 1 minute to go. Stop. And that was the only other words. And so the person would just start talking. Now, if they stopped talking at 4 minutes, if they ran out of things to say at 4 minutes, we weren't done. We sat there in silence until the person said 1 minute to go and then stop. Well, guess what? There were a few folks who tried to stop, but that silence, they can't. So they start talking again, right? And because there's nobody commenting at all, people will run through their sort of 3 minute, you know, here's what I'm comfortable saying about myself. And then the next thing you know, they are saying everything. Everything about you comes out. Stuff you would never thought you were going to come into this group and admit to or tell them. And so when it was done, that group of 6 were all like wide-eyed looking at each other because we know everything about each other. And it was not like a bad thing. Like people were getting up and hugging other people and like, I don't know why you feel that way. You know, that you are such a valuable I mean, the outpouring of support from a human perspective because of how this introduction worked was incredible. And the interesting thing for me to watch was those folks who just refused to be at all vulnerable, right? Who just were going to do a 10-minute recitation of their resume, right? And that's all they were capable of doing. They did not get the same thing out of any of the program, right? Because they never bonded, they never opened up. And what people then found out about who each of them were in terms of their identifications and all of that later on meant nothing. They had bonded at levels that would take years for us normally to do with fairly simple exercises. It's kind of amazing.
That reminds me of two things. One, I want to go back to, so remind me, let's talk about vulnerability. But the other thing it reminds me of, there was a dating exercise that became popular probably 5 years ago, or at least that's when I heard about it, which is like you're supposed to look and stare into your partner's eyes for 10 minutes. And they could do this with like a couple that they literally just pulled off the street and sat down and had them stare into each other's eyes.
Okay.
And to a couple and to a couple who had been together, and something about that, the intimacy of staring somebody straight in the eye and just allowing the discomfort to wash over both of you in that moment creates intimacy even with strangers. So I think that exercise of divulging yourself it can happen physically too, right? And
oh yeah.
But in the context that we're talking about today, I think we want to talk about bridging the divide in terms of using our listening skills. And when you said vulnerability in the exercise you were discussing, I think that's really true. It's so easy to have our pat answers to topics that make us feel emotional, whether it's the health and safety of our family during COVID-19, whether it's our political belief and affiliation. And it's much easier to generate that emotional pat response. This is my viewpoint, and not be vulnerable, to open up and find out who you're talking to. And if they do have a different perspective or viewpoint, why? What's their background? What did they bring to it? How did they arrive there? I mean, we can't truly influence we can't truly grow in our own beliefs or influence others in believing the way we do if we're not having an open, vulnerable dialogue about who we are and how we come to our beliefs.
I think there's a word here, being personally vulnerable allows you to speak out, maybe, right? But I think the word respect is an incredibly important word. So growing up, I am not Jewish, but growing up, I went to a Jewish school, and I knew the history of the Jewish history. I knew everything there was to know about Israel, everything you would expect if you had gone to a Jewish school. I also ended up with a whole bunch of friends who were Palestinians, some of whom had actually been in wars against Israel, who talked about trekking across the desert in Jordan to escape and all this other stuff. And at no point in time with my Jewish friends, my Palestinian friends, did any of them think in some way that I was against them or for them, right? My whole thing was I had respect for who they were. And that allowed me to actually become somebody who had some interactions, not in a big sense, but in a local, small sense of demonstrating the talking across the bridging divides of local Jewish folks and local Palestinians talking, obviously in this country, not in Israel, not where there's the front lines, but that's still making those conversations happen. And the only thing I'm doing different maybe is having an absolute inherent intrinsic sense that everybody should be respected, right? Just you're somebody, what you have a reason for being here. You have something to say. Let's go ahead and have that conversation and see what value there is there from each of the people having the conversation.
So from the standpoint, let's frame this in a business perspective for the small business folks that are listening to this conversation. Why is this important and why now?
I think it's important because we've been placed. There's a very narrow conversation going on with our current crises. Very narrow. You are either somebody who is more worried about saving people's lives, and therefore we must lock down any attempts to go back to work or to deal with the economic side of things is just you trying to kill us, right? And then you got the other side, which is we must open up at all costs. It doesn't matter. It's economic is everything, to heck with masks, to heck with this silliness. We're doing more, the cure can't be worse than the disease concept, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. That is the most narrow and poorly designed way to deal with two very large and very real crises. Being able to have an intelligent conversation about, okay, this disease is real and people don't want to die from it, and they don't want relatives of theirs to die from it, and they don't want their neighbor to die from it. Okay. That is a legitimate place to be. And we have spent our lives building up savings, building a business, working to have security, and now we can't pay our mortgage and we're using up all of our savings to survive, and our business hasn't been open in months, and I'm going to end up declaring bankruptcy if this goes on. Those are very equally legitimate concerns. There are solutions that take into account both. We don't have to end up fighting each other over only one way is the right way and everything else be damned. If we're going to do a far better job on all fronts, if we acknowledge the concerns of all sides and legitimately work together for both crises.
I agree. And I think when we repeat bad positioning, bad frame of reference, when we get into the rhetoric and we just say what's been said before, it kind of becomes a mantra to fall on deaf ears because people dismiss it out of hand. They've heard it before. So, from my perspective, I think it's incumbent on each person to process the scenarios that are going on and how they're being impacted on it and articulate that out in their unique voice in an authentic way, because that's how these subjects become approachable, where we can have real dialogue around them and we can start making changes from a grassroots level, whether it's through advocacy and different types of engagement and involvement through partnership. I think that's how you impact Main Streets and not just, fall victim to these two big crisis mentalities.
And politicized. I mean, but in both of those cases, both crises that we're talking about, one is economic, and one is health. Neither are political. So why we lead with political is beyond me. But coming back around to your idea of that whole collaboration and that Main Street mentality, every single business, let's say restaurant, that opens up on a main street in a small town, right, or a big town, and they're like, okay, we're opening back to business as usual. Now, most likely there was a dynamic related to that street. Was it near a waterfront and people would walk up from the waterfront to get to their parking and they would stop in the shops or they would stop to eat? Is it a destination street where that's where you go to hang out and they have the best nightlife and the best restaurants? And, Was there a theater that anchored that street, right? And all of that made the whole thing work and made your business as one little tiny integral piece of that. That helped support your business. That brought you your clients. That put you in that place. So now you go back and you open up, and the two places next to you are vacant. The theater's still not open. People aren't coming to the street. And the fact that you've managed to reopen your business, so what? So there is a micro macro environment here where it's not just you. It's not just how am I going to open? It's how are we going to open? How are we going to, in this new norm, make that dynamic work so that all those businesses, that street is functional, not closed down?
Yeah, to bring it back to a television example, since we started a television commercial. So Gordon Ramsay visited Ellicott City, Maryland, which is, as anybody local will know, they've had a lot of crises in the last few years, several floods that wiped out the whole town, more or less. And of course, the economic crisis that we're going through now as well. So when they go in and they do these business makeovers, they never just remodel one business. If there's a barbershop, a bookstore, a restaurant, and a cafe, they go in and they revitalize that piece of Main Street for a reason, right? Because these businesses don't succeed in a vacuum. A lot of times success or failure is tied, exactly like you just said, to what's bringing people there and what makes a good community.
And let me just say this. Going back to the leadership Anne Arundel example. So we just had all those people sit in that group and now they're bonded. Now we're going and we're dealing with politics, economics, we're dealing with agriculture, we're dealing with health and human services, we're dealing with education, we're dealing with every single aspect of Anne Arundel County in all of its controversy and different ways to approach it and different beliefs. And everybody who came into that, and they're bonded, but they came in with their predispositions to what they believe and what they know. And here are some things I witnessed at the end of that program. I witnessed, and this is hyperbole almost, but it's a perfect example. I witnessed this 4'10", 68-year-old woman who was a tree hugger environmentalist and very strident, right? And she was in a class with a couple of 35-year-old young Wall Street kind of guys who everything was about business, and how much could they make and what was the profit margin. I mean, you take those two extremes, and they had no political connections at all. And it was fun to watch them at the end, acknowledging how much they enjoyed being in class together, making a little fun of each other, but hugs all around. And I would not have gotten as much had I not seen your perspectives. And then had folks say things like, it's amazing how interconnected economics, the arts, health and human services, all of these things are all interconnected. And it's so easy for us in the one silo that we know to think everything runs through that understanding, and to see how it all ripples and connects is so overwhelming. We now realize we need to pay attention to those other silos. We can't live in our own. Okay, that's why those programs are great, but that's how we all need to think now. We may not have time to go through a program to be shown this. We need to recognize this is a wake-up call. This is a wake-up call for small business and Main Street. We are watching right now how the fact that we have not paid attention and not had a place at the table is biting us all. We are not an integral part of the conversation or the solutions that are being offered. We're just collateral damage. So there's no reason not to wake up and figure out how to collaborate and figure out how to not have this go back to usual. All of you wanting it to go back to usual, wrong message here. Come out of this and go towards something different. We've seen all the weaknesses and cracks in the foundations because of this.
What I'm hearing you say, Patrick, is it's incumbent upon you to bridge this divide.
Yeah, it's all individual effort.
All right. Well, I think that's where we'll leave it today on the SBI Reimagining Main Street podcast. Patrick, thanks for being here today. And everybody, thanks for listening.
Bye, everybody.